So we are talking about Alexander the Great. Remember, we last week we talked about he went through and overthrew the Persian king Darius III in 330 BC. So keep us our timeline going here. 330 BC. So we're talking about 2,400 years ago or so now, 2,400 years ago. He left most of the satraps and the bureaucracy in place. I mean, think about how big the Persian Empire was. He really had to leave a lot of the bureaucracy in place in order to keep it together. And for the short time that Alexander lived after that, after this time, he was able to keep the empire together. It didn't fall apart until after he died. We're going to talk about that today. But this is the empire of Alexander. You can see it's vast it's big by today's standards. But it went all the way from Greece here on the west, clear through modern day Middle East, Egypt, all the way through. This is Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, and the very western part of India. So you can see an extremely large empire. And right here in the middle, well, kind of along the neck here, are our heroes. The Jewish nation is settling they're right in here. They've been hanging out here now for a couple hundred years since they've come back from Babylonian captivity. And you see Jerusalem on the map. This is desert. This is really wilderness down here. Funny, Alexander did have plans to conquer Arabia. He was whipping up some pretty aggressive plans. He was looking to go down this way and see what he could see what was happening down there. That really it would be more of a coastal, along the coast where you would have any type of success. He also had plans to circumnavigate Africa. They knew you could go around it. Here's a funny thing. We think about when Columbus sailed across in 1492. People were asking whether or not he was going to fall off the edge of the ocean. Right? They knew the Earth was round. A couple thousand years ago, they've known the Earth was round. If you take an ocean voyage south for very far, you'll figure out the Earth is round. You'll see the stars are moved. Something's not right. You can tell it's going to fall. So they knew. So Alexander actually had he had drawn up plans to circumnavigate Africa. I mean, think about how incredible of a feat that would be in 300 BC. Didn't quite make it that far. They were never able to put those plans in place. So we've got this time here now where Alexander's coming back. The capital here is in Persepolis, right here. This was the capital of the Persian Empire. This is where the palace was. So that's old Babylon, basically, is what you're talking about. Remember, Babylon was a province that overthrew Assyria, and then Babylon, the Babylonian influence. You had the Babylonian culture in here. The Persian culture is really modern-day Iran. So basically, Iraq is this area here. That's really what you would consider to be Babylon, and then Persia off to the east. So he's trying to get this all together. And now you've got this tremendous Greek influence coming through, and now the Jews grew up, dealing with another, right, grappling with another change of leadership and change of culture that's starting to come through. It's coming through very, very fast. So to win over the allegiance of the Persian nobility and mostly the Iranian influence there in that area. He began appropriating many Iranian customs during this time, principally that of alliance through marriage. And so one of the things he did very soon is he took one of Darius's daughters, Roxanne, as his wife. And give you a little flash forward. Remember now, he's young still. He's 30 years old roughly, and he's got no children. So he takes this Persian princess, essentially as his wife, in a way to, now you've got this massive empire, right? That's all, it's 95% foreigners. They're not Greeks. So the way you're going to influence and be accepted by these people is you're going to have an heir that is in line with Darius, right? Remember, that was their king, right, who died in this whole war. So if your heir now can be a descendant of him, you've now got some validity and some, it's going to be easier for the people, especially the Persians, to accept you. Yeah. So this was the plan he had going on. So A little bit of hint. She gets pregnant. She's expecting. Of course, back in those days, they didn't have ultrasounds. They had no idea if this is a boy or a girl. So you're kind of waiting to see what this is going to be. So think about this now, right? You're going to have an heir, hopefully a boy. That's what they're thinking, but they don't know, right? What would happen, you think, if he had a girl?
Try again.
Try again.
Yeah.
But what else are you going to do? What else? What did we just see happen?
I'll marry her.
You're going to marry her up, right? I'll marry her to someone. This is the way it worked back then. If you think about it, right? This is what you were doing back then. You were trying to build alliances and build credibility and establish your dynasty through marriage and things like that. So you can see him doing this, right? Because now it looks to me like he's completely given up on being Greek or Macedonian at this point. He never goes back there. He spends the rest of his life here in the capital, Persepolis. So he basically becomes Persian in practice. He leaves one of his generals, Antipater. This is important. So I have Antipater and Antipater, how do you want to pronounce that? He leaves him in charge of Greece. We talked about that while he goes off on his conquest. So he's sitting back here, and he apparently, somewhere along this way, Roxanne and the unborn child end up back here, somehow, during this. And we're going to find out about that. She ends up back there somehow. So he's dealing with all kinds of stuff back here while Alexander's dealing with Persia. And then somewhere around early June, late May of 323, Alexander takes very ill. And this is very sudden. It's really out of nowhere. It's when he had come back, very shortly after he came back from the Indian campaign. He takes ill. He's very ill for about 12 days and dies. Now, there's lots of debate here. Was he poisoned? Did he just get sick? So, if you read a lot of history about Alexander, it's a lot of talk about that, that people think he was poisoned, right? Because that was, remember we talked about, that was the practice here, right? But the problem is, they really can't figure out who would want to poison, who would do it, number one. Number two, back in those days, there weren't any, long-acting poisons like that they knew about. They didn't, most poisons are going to kill you pretty quick, So they couldn't, he was sick for a long, long time. Something like 12 weeks or something like that. He was sick for a very long time. And so then he dies. So he dies before the child's born. So now it's like, okay, what are we going to do? Do we wait for the child to be born? Let's see if it's a boy, right? Do we, what are we going to do? And so he's got this close circle of people around him as he's dying. So he's got some time to, give some final directions along the way. And so the famous story here now, his closest confidants are around him. He's dying. He's in his last days. And they ask him, what do you want us to do? What should we do with your empire? Who will inherit your empire? And it depends on whose history you read. But the predominant history is he says, to the strongest. That's what he says. So how do you think they interpret that?
Fight for it.
Got to fight it out. Yeah. These were what they interpret to be his last words. Okay. So now they're going to have to figure out what we're going to do. We've got this unborn child coming. Could be a boy. Remember, it's going to have bloodline from Darius. It's going to have Alexander. What are we going to do? They did agree to put this one guy in charge as regent until the child was born, and if it was a boy, until it came of age. That's what they kind of agreed to do. And the problem is, he's just not really strong enough to hold this together. And so the child's born. It is a boy. It is Alexander. They name him Alexander the Fourth. Alexander the Great also had a stepbrother, but we believe he was mentally unfit in some way. He was being taken care of his whole life. There was something there, he wasn't fit to take charge. So it was more or less just had this half-brother that no one was really going to give any credibility to. He was just kind of hanging out back there in Macedon. So now you've got this baby born. You've got this regent who's going to hold it together until Alexander comes of age. But he's just not able to do it. He's just not able to hold it together. So what ends up happening is, during this time of regency here, some of these key figures in Alexander's circle start basically squatting. right? We talked about Ptolemy, comes down here. He declares himself Ptolemy the First, king of Egypt. A lot of fighting over Syria, this area right here. There's a lot of fighting back and forth here. It's going to take that. This Antipater guy. This is who, if anybody poisoned, they think it could have been this guy. Because here's what happened. When Alexander went off, he left Antipater in charge of this back here. Remember Olympia was Alexander's mother? Apparently these two didn't get along very well. And so they were constantly writing letters to Alexander complaining about each other the whole time. Like for 15 years. Alexander keeps getting letters of both of these just complaining about each other. And so here comes, before Alexander dies, he gets called to Alexander at Persepolis. And he interprets that, and there's room that he interprets that as, this is probably death sentence, right? Probably why they're calling him. So the thought, and then he had a son, this is important, named Cassander. That was his son. He left Cassander in charge and went off, and they think that if somebody poisoned him, these guys might have done it. They might have done it. So, but it's also very possible he just got sick. I mean, think about what he was doing, where he was going. He was all over the place. He's Macedonian. He probably doesn't have a lot of immunity. He's in Afghanistan. He's in Egypt. He's in India. He's everywhere, right? He might have caught something. He might have eaten something bad. We don't really know. We'll probably never know. But he ends up dying, and then this boy is born. This guy is going to be regent. He loses control. It starts to fall apart, and these generals start hacking up the empire and fighting it out. And there's a war. It's called the War of the Successors. And this is many years long, where these guys are really carving it up, fighting it out, trying to establish some semblance of, they're making their own empire. These guys are Greek, but they are looking for more. Yeah, exactly right. Ptolemy carves out an empire, which is basically the Persian Empire, this section of the Persian Empire, clear up here to incorporate modern-day Israel and Lebanon, essentially this area right here. He goes up to here, and what do you think? And then Antigonus was a general that took over this whole area here. He ends up losing it to a guy named Seleucus. So you've ever heard of the Seleucid Empire? That's going to play a major point in Israel's future here very shortly. Seleucus takes control of this whole area here, and what do you think happens?
Start fighting?
Who's in the middle of it? Jews, right in the middle of it again. So for about the next 150 years or so, 160 years, there's going to be constant battle over this area. But for now, this Ptolemy guy is pretty tolerant. He's pretty calm. In fact, he is, we talked last week about the Septuagint. What is the Septuagint? Anybody remember what that is?
The translated Old Testament into Greek.
Yes, the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek. One of his descendants has that done. Remember, these guys are in Ptolemy's kingdom here, right? So these are his subjects. They speak this strange language, this Hebrew language up here. What is this all about? He's building this fantastic library down here at Alexandria. Alexandria is about right here. And he says, I want this thing in my library. Can you come down and translate? So see, these folks seem to be very tolerant. The Greeks were interesting. We're going to talk about Hellenization here in just a minute. But they were the strange blend of absorbing culture. The culture kind of changes and morphs along the way, but yet they also kind of instill their culture. I think a lot of it kind of like American culture, if you think about it. How does American culture spread? You think about how we spread our culture around the world. Through our media, right? TV and music, and movies, and entertainment, architecture maybe, language. And so what ends up happening is if you want to do anything with us, you want to be part of what we've got going on, you got to speak English, right? I mean, you want to be at our party, you kind of got to speak our language, right? So the same thing kind of happens here. So over time, the Greek language becomes, if you want to deal with the rulers, you want to deal with the people in charge, you want to make money and commerce all over this empire, you got to do it in Greek, but there's also some really cool stuff happening locally here too, right? So they absorb a lot of it, they transfer a lot of it, it just morphs and changes over time, and they start to absorb and influence the areas that they have control over. So very interesting story about the Ptolemaic. This was the almost the last of Alexander's kingdoms to survive. There's one way out here at the end that holds on to they're the last ones to fall, way out here. They're the last ones, you can see. But other than that, the Ptolemaic dynasty lasts clear up until Cleopatra and basically Julius Caesar. That time frame right there. That's how long they hold on. Any thoughts, questions about that so far? I'm flying there. Make sense? Yeah. So we're gonna take a quick peek into the future real fast. Something's going on over here to the west. These guys, by now, we're at 300 BC, basically, right? Alexander's dead by 323. For the next 20 years or so, you've got this war of the successors. Meanwhile, these guys are building up over here. And what we're going to see in a couple of weeks is they have something that really causes them to grow and expand. And they become very, what's called acquisitory. They're going to go out and they're going to start acquiring, they're going to grow through conquest, basically. You had one big, massive empire here in 323. If you tried to attack this empire in 323, you'd be in big trouble. Because think about how massive that is, right? How strong and how wealthy that is. 100 years from now, when it's all sliced up, or 100 years from this time, when it's all sliced up, there's crazy breaking up happening over here. They are just perfectly ripe for the Romans. And so what ends up happening in about 100 years is the Romans start coming along and start picking these guys off one by one, picking them off. You can see it kind of just moving. One of the reasons why the last ones just takes a while to get there, right? Besides that, the Ptolemaics kind of play along. They have a kind of a reputation for just playing along a little bit. It's kind of, they aren't acquisitory, they aren't into expanding, they never go out and, cause any trouble, whereas the Seleucids were pretty troublesome. They caused Israel a lot of trouble. We'll look at that here in a couple of weeks. So this is all setting up, since it's all sliced up in little chunks, it's all setting up now for the Romans to come along and just kind of carve them up here in about 100 years or so. So Ptolemy proclaims himself pharaoh. He's pharaoh of, he becomes, and he's a Greek, right? His whole descendants are Greek, of course. It's kind of funny, we're going to look at this next week as well. If you were a male in the succession, your name was Ptolemy, and if you were a female in the succession, your name was Cleopatra. We talked about that last week. There's a lot of Cleopatras, a lot of Ptolemies, but they actually are pretty benign, and they treat the Jews up here fairly well. They're very happy to be in this kind of Ptolemaic family. It doesn't really appear that there's any trouble there at all until the Seleucids up here start to get involved. So thus begins a process of spreading Greek culture and influence across the world, and that's called Hellenization. So Hellenization is the process by which the non-Greek world starts to take on Greek attributes. There's actually a pretty good example of that. Some archaeological examples of that here. This is the floor of a Jewish synagogue, and this is all Greek. Greek mosaic, Greek writing. Very interesting. So what they found is, this is happening in lots of ways. You've got architecture, right? You've got language, of course. We talked about that. You've got economic commerce. You've got things like that happening.
Knowledge, too.
Knowledge. Yeah, exactly right. If you wanted to do business around the known world at that time, you had to be Greek. You had to Hellenize. It's like us. If you want to do business with us, you've kind of got to take on our customs. You've got to take on our ethics. You've got to conform to our legal expectations and things like that. So that's really what happened. Everybody, including the Jews here, just were Hellenized. Now, it appears that there wasn't a lot of pushback, that the Jews took that on and there wasn't any trouble. That trouble doesn't happen for about another 160 years or so when the Greeks try to impose a polytheism. That's when the trouble starts. It appears that as long as they were allowed to keep the monotheistic philosophy that the Jews had, that everything was fine. They were perfectly fine to change their architecture. Perfectly fine to do that. We're perfectly fine to use Greek in our business. We're perfectly fine to call Ptolemy the king. We're perfectly fine to do that. But once the Greeks started imposing a polytheistic mandate, this is when the Jewish problem happens. And so we're going to see that here in about 160 years. We're going to see when that starts to, it ignites like that. I think it's really, really strong. Also adoption of Greek personal names. Jesus, that's a Greek name. There's an example. Joshua became Jason or Jesus. Peter comes from Petros. So you start to see this morphing of names, right? This is all the Hellenization at work here. Most names characters in the New Testament are Greek names that we use. Do you ever see a like I've got an interlinear that has this. It has the original Hebrew names and things like that. Do you ever see that? With the Hebrew? Very different than the names we use. We're using the Greek names. Development of Jewish Hellenistic literature and philosophy. We talked about architecture and political structures. They started taking on their political structures as well. So you've kind of got these four general time frames, write this out, within which this all happens. So you've got the Alexander period. This is the Hellenistic, what we call the Hellenistic periods. So you've got the Alexander one, 332 to 298 roughly. Ptolemaic. This is from the context and perspective of the Jews here. The Ptolemaic was 296 to 201. So that's the period of time with which the Ptolemaic subjects for about 100 years. And then the Seleucids come in and take over, and this is when the trouble starts. From 200 to 104, there's a period of time in here, we're going to call it the Hasmonean. Hope you can read my chicken scratch. This is from about 104 to 63, but at about 167, there's a big revolt. That's the Maccabean revolt we're going to talk about. We'll spend a whole day talking about that, because that's very, very significant. The Maccabean revolt against the Seleucids is what creates Jesus' Judea. The Judea that we see in the New Testament comes out of that Maccabean revolt against the Seleucids in 167 BC. This is the important moment. Remember I talked about there's three watershed moments. The first one is the Hellenization when the Greeks come in. Talked about it last week. This is number one, right? The Greeks are coming in. They're changing everything, right? The Persians, the Babylonians are gone. It's Greek now. Big change, number one. Number two is when the Seleucids take over and you have this massive revolt in 167. And this was the desecration of the temple and things like that, trying to wipe out the monotheism that the Jews practiced. That's the second. That's a big one. Then the third one is 63. Anybody know what happens there? Take a guess. Yeah, that's when Rome comes in. So that's when Rome comes in. So those are the three big watershed moments. So you've got this massive imposition of Greek culture happening, and you've got them one more time at the crossroads of conflict here, where there's going to be some, remember, to the strongest. So who's going to dominate? Who's going to take it all over? It's a big battle that goes on for quite a couple hundred years, trying to establish supremacy in this area. But all it really serves to do is just weaken the Greek Empire to the point that when the Romans become strong, they're ripe for the pickings here from about 150 or so until 63 BC. Yeah. What are your thoughts about that? Any takeaways? Any thoughts? Questions?
Well, when David did this, David, the head of the Jewish Empire,
King David?
actually did.
About 150 BC.
Okay.
Yeah. King David, this would have been about, we're talking 700 years after David.
Okay.
Yeah. King David ruled 1050 BC. So, yeah, this is 700 years later.
Before all this stuff.
It's a lot, yeah. That's interesting. I mean, I don't know if you guys like timelines, time frame. I'm fascinated by that stuff personally. If you haven't picked that up yet, I think it's kind of fascinating to see like the time frames. Just in general, Abraham was about 2000 BC. It's on that initial thing you have there. About 2000 or so. Abraham, 2100, something like that. Moses about 1500 BC. David about 1000. Now you have the establishment of the nation of Israel with the king, with Saul about 20 years before this, or so. And then 500 BC is when Babylonian captivity comes in, and now we're dead center in the middle of the intertestamental period here, right? Yes, sir.
You say the Ptolemaic period was 296 to 201, so about 95 years. And you said there was a lot of Cleopatras and a lot of Ptolemies. In 95 years, how many?
Well, that's just the time frame that these guys were in it.
Okay.
Ptolemaics last clear up until the Battle of Actium was 50-something, I think.
As I was thinking, 95 years, how many rulers did they go through in that
A
time
lot.
frame?
A lot. Yeah, so Ptolemy declares himself king somewhere around 300 BC, something like that. And when Julius Caesar comes in and takes out he comes in and basically establishes himself somewhere around 70 BC. You've heard of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, you've heard that? Okay, those are real people. There was a Roman civil war that took place after Julius Caesar dies. Mark Antony recruits the Ptolemies as his ally during that whole thing. They are defeated at the Battle of Actium by who would eventually become Augustus Caesar. His name was Octavian at the time. And when Antony and Cleopatra are defeated in the Battle of Actium, which takes place up here, it's a naval battle. When they get defeated in that, then the Ptolemaic Empire is destroyed. Okay. Somewhere around 50, I think. Somewhere. Yes, ma'am.
I think it's amazing that God gave them the crossroads of three
Right.
continents. Three. Africa, Asia, and Europe.
Yeah.
He put them in the prime spot.
Yeah, they're not sitting out here, just kind of stewing for 2,000 years. They are right in the middle. I mean, this is the I-17 and Bell Road. Right? I mean, they're right in the middle. Everybody's going by. Everybody's going through over and over and over again.
And the best place to spread Christianity throughout the world.
Yeah.
The world.
Yeah, absolutely right.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely right. That's a good point.
What providence of God to do that.
Yeah. And what I see too, if you think about it, if you just look out at the little tiny time frames, look back over all this time, these people that made big influences were just there for a minute. The Babylonians were just there for a minute, just to do a job. Then the Persians were just there for a minute. Then the Greeks were just there for a minute, right? And the Romans were just there for a short period of time. Then it changed. But you're right. I think there's location is critical here. The people that came through and influenced and provided the resources for the church to eventually do what it needed to do.
Be throughout the world.
Yeah.
The world.
Yeah. If you look at a map of the known world at the time, that's probably dead center in the middle of it. Good insight. Yeah. What else? Good stuff. So Cassander, sad story, takes over. Remember when they're carving it all up, he takes over the area that his father was given in charge of. He ends up with Roxana and Alexander IV. He ends up in possession of them. If you're carving up the empire and you want to be king of Greece, and you've got this child of Alexander IV in your possession, what do you think happened?
You either get rid of them or you foster that relationship.
Yeah, probably a smart, long-term thinking person would say, "I'll be the new regent until you come of age." Yeah, but he doesn't do that. Yeah. So he puts Roxana and Alexander IV to death. Very sad. So basically eliminates any threat to his throne. Remember, we keep talking about that's the cycle that happens over and over and over. It's the way these people behaved back then. So the line of Alexander is done there, and Cassander then is here, and the reward for his behavior is just constant warfare here, constant warfare. It just slices up into little chunks. He loses whatever he had over here, so that when Rome's ready, he is just ready and ripe, and they basically get what they ask for. So they're the first to go when Rome expands. So, yeah. We talked about the fact there was pretty firm economic bond here between Judea and the Ptolemaic kingdom. Again, the Ptolemies ruled from Alexandria, so here's the capital. They ruled from Alexandria. And it doesn't appear that most Jews during this time considered Greek rulers any worse than anybody else. I mean, it looks like they they were amazingly compliant and pliable people during this time. They just seemed to just go along. And I think Jim had a good observation a couple weeks ago. They learned their lesson, I think he said. I think they kind of learned the lesson. Whatever that cleansing was through Babylonian captivity and all that, they seem to have come back a changed people. And remember, they didn't hold up Alexander when he's marching south here. They didn't. Otherwise, Jerusalem would have been slaughtered and it would have been wiped. They seem to have learned their lesson, and they accepted the Ptolemies as perfectly fine. In fact, when I think it's Ptolemy II calls them down to do the Septuagint, they eagerly send some of the best scribes. In fact, they established synagogue down here, and a lot of Jews lived here. Alexandria had a vibrant Jewish culture at that time. There's lots of Greek writings that hold up the Jews and Judaism in a very favorable light by the standards of the Greek culture. So they were also preserved during this time as well. So what you didn't want, of course, was somebody to come along and stamp it out, right? You wanted something to be almost like taken care of and preserved. And maybe the Seleucids had similar feelings too, because they wanted this area. They kept fighting to take that area there. Under the rules of the Ptolemies in the Second Seleucid Empire, the Judea witnessed a period of peace and protection, and their institutions were preserved. There's some evidence that they were given some funds to rebuild remember now, the temple now, they're in the second temple, right? It's been rebuilt from Solomon's temple. But we're talking, this thing now is how old? I mean, this thing's pretty old, right? I mean, if it was built in Solomon's time, so we're talking about 1000 BC was the original temple, rebuilt under Ezra and Nehemiah, somewhere around 500. So now we're at 250. This thing's pretty old, right? So they actually, this is interesting. When the Seleucids took over this area finally, somewhere around 200 BC, it looks like the Jews might have helped them out a little bit. Now, we don't know why. It's not really clear as to why they did that, because things worked pretty good under the Ptolemies. But for some reason, they helped out the Seleucids. So that Second Seleucid Empire was pretty friendly to them, and gave them some funds to rebuild the temple again, or kind of clean it up and restore it. Because remember, this thing's 800 years old by this point, right? And so there's some evidence, too, that some Greek writers and philosophers defended Judaism's monotheistic philosophy, saying that it anticipated some of the tenets of Greek philosophy. Remember we talked about that a few weeks ago, that the Greeks started to develop some philosophies that were very, very different than what was around them. And one of them was this idea that, maybe there isn't all these gods. Maybe there is just one. That perks up here once in a while. So there's some writings saying that these Jews, maybe they're onto something, right? So they were kind of given some credence. So as a result of that, they were looked at very favorably until a bad guy comes along in this dynasty here and does them some harm in about 167. But that's really where the story ends for now. Is you've got the kingdom divided up into multiple kingdoms. It was 4 basic ones to start, but of course they start to dissolve after a while, and especially far out east, that breaks up pretty soon into smaller little kingdoms. It's just too big. It's just too big. Any thoughts, questions?
What did you say about the Maccabees?
Maccabees, yeah. So, just do a teaser on that, because that's a whole bit. So what ends up happening is, during this Seleucid, looks like Seleucid, during this time, remember, these guys were pagans, right? I mean, they didn't have, and they came from a military background. They came from this background of, aggression and conquest, and, So the descendants of this empire just got more slowly and slowly more corrupt and just bad guys. And there's one guy named Antiochus IV. He ends up being a pretty bad guy. What we see ends up, and he's a Seleucid. He ends up being ruler of the Seleucid Empire. And what happens is, now by this point, we're at 167 BC. What's been happening? Rome's coming farther, right? Rome's just creeping this way, and now they're on the doorstep, right? He goes to war, fights Rome, gets in a tussle with them, doesn't get defeated, but he comes out of that really kind of in a bad mood, right? And it looks like he just takes it out on these Jews down here. And he does some pretty bad stuff to the temple. The apocryphal books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees talk about this, what happens here. He desecrates the temple, and it looks like by this point, now you've been Greek now for how long? We're at 167, 170 years. So multiple generations have grown up with the Greek culture, and like any place, there's some Jews who are just okay with this, right? They're just like they were back in Elijah's time. Very happy with multiple gods, and right? And this happens every once in a while. So there was like, well, okay, if this is what we're going to do, we're going to do. And this one family stands up and basically executes one of these guys, like in public. One of his officers in public, and says, we're not going to do this, and boom, and that starts a massive revolt, and there's a war that goes on here for a couple of years. They don't get their independence, but they get left alone. And so the Seleucids kind of pull out and pull away, and that begins eventually this thing called the Hasmonean dynasty, which is they get their own king again for about 100 years-ish. That's what the Maccabees were. Who has that? Yeah, the Maccabean was his name was Judas Maccabees, and Maccabees, I guess the translation means the hammer. So it's a slang term. But that's what the Maccabean revolt is. It's the revolt against this Seleucid rule. Yeah. Good question. Anything else? See if we missed anything. Interesting, as things come full circle, Alexander died in Nebuchadnezzar's palace. I mean, I imagine that was a fantastic place. You know, one of the 7 wonders of the world were the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Yeah. So this is probably a pretty fantastic palace. And he going along, he's saying, "It's a pretty good place. I'm going to make this my hangout." So that's where he dies. And again, it just kind of disintegrates and falls apart after his death, and it just becomes ripe pickings for the Romans that come along. Yeah, and then we're dead center in the middle of Hellenization now, and so next week I'm going to be gone, and Dale's going to take the class for us next week, and he's going to show a really interesting video that talks about how Hellenization happened, and what happened along this way, and what it was like with the Seleucids and the Ptolemies here, and kind of what happened to Alexander's empire, and how that Greek influence just kind of morphed into the Jewish culture. So it's really kind of interesting to see how you ended up with the Israel of Jesus' time. Right? How did that happen? Right? It happens because you've got several hundred years of living in a completely different cultural norm than what they had known. If you think about it, I mean, it's Western, right? If you're talking about Greece, you're talking about kind of European culture, right? You're not talking about Eastern culture anymore. So it's a strange blend of that, right? Rome is a Western culture. Greece is a Western culture. Yeah. So that's what we're going to do next week. And then when we come back from that, we should be right together to break down the Maccabean revolt and how we ended up with the Hasmoneans. And then just a little teaser, that's how you end up eventually with Herod. You ever wonder where Herod came from? So we're going to end up, this is where Herod eventually comes from. Herod the Great, of course, and then the Herod of Jesus' time, and how the Romans end up in there. So that's what this, all this is one unfolding story that ends up at the beginning of Matthew.